I'm a volunteer with Nefesh B'Nefesh. I myself made Aliyah with Nefesh B'Nefesh. And here at Cafe Oleh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to succeed, whether that's reading your electricity bills, going grocery shopping and reading nutritional labels, keeping up with the news, starting a conversation, going on a job interview, going on a date, all the everyday things you do in your respective countries of origin, but here in Israel and in Hebrew. As always, we'd love to hear what topics you'd like us to cover that we haven't already. All of our previous lessons are up on youtube.com. Just type in Cafe Oleh or Nefesh B'Nefesh. You'll see a playlist of all of our previous lessons. This one will go up in the next few days as well. You can also write to us here either in the chat if you're joining us on Zoom, or to Nefesh B'Nefesh directly by email with any requests that you have for topics. We are actually getting to the end of our summer session here. We have this week, and next week will be our last until we break for the rest of the summer and the holiday season, the Chagim, in the early fall. So without further ado, let's get to today's topic. So last week we talked about emotions, not necessarily all the emotions, but a lot of the different words we use to express commonly held emotions, commonly expressed emotions, and how to express them. Today, we're going to do a topic that I alluded to last week is a little difficult, and it's not difficult because of the grammar. We focus here on intro level, so it's not about the grammar necessarily, it's about the topic at hand, which is identity. Israel is, we talk about identity all the time. We talk about it in the context of politics, we talk about it in the context of societal relations, we talk about it in the context of everything. We find a reason to talk about identity. Identity is anyways complicated. Here in Israel, it's no less complicated. And today we're going to go through some of the words that we use to describe ourselves identity-wise on a regular basis here in Israel, and some of the major identity groups and markers here in Israel. And equally important, and this is the part I'm going to need your extra special attention to not type, to not do anything else when I go through this section, are the words that are used to describe other people that are completely unacceptable to use. And as you'll see in the big red marker, when we get to that page of our vocabulary today, strongly consider you calling out someone or telling someone not to use those words if you hear them. It's not that I'm teaching you to use those, God forbid. I'm teaching you to recognize that that is a part of Israeli society. It doesn't mean we have to support it, but you should know the words, the context, and they are so important and so terrible to use. I'm actually not going to say them aloud, but you will see them written out in regular Hebrew and transliteration, and we're going to go through the origin of them, a little bit more explanation as to why they're not good words to use. And I also have a treat at the end in terms of music, both because this is a difficult topic, but also it helps further illustrate this topic at the end with time allotting. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Let me just make sure I have the right one open first. I do not. Just one second. As always, if you have questions while I am talking and teaching about this specific lesson, please write it in the Q&A window here on Zoom if you're joining us live. If you have questions, concerns, comments, compliments, anything else, please write that in the chat. Okay, I'm only going to be looking at the Q&A today, so just bear with me one second, folks. Okay, and obviously we're teaching these words in the context of Israeli culture and society, so there is going to be a little bit more than just teaching these words straight up, but a little bit more context behind them. So let's get started. So first off, as always, Hebrew's in the middle, transliteration on the right, English on the left, some gender and notes on the left about each word, and I'm going to explain them as we go. So this, you're also welcome to screenshot these words, old school pen and paper. And like I said, this will be up in the next few days on YouTube, so you can go back, review it, pause the screen, write down the words, screenshot them as you will. So we're talking about identity. It's also worth noting, as I said last week, that those of us who made Aliyah were minorities in our respective countries of origin, and now we're in the majority. So those are also important words to think about as much as the ideas that that includes. So first off, what's the word for majority? Rov, or rov. Okay, this can be the majority of anything. The majority of apples in the bag were ripe. The majority of people in X population voted for Y party. It's also worth noting we're doing this lesson several months ahead of the next electoral season, and unfortunately our elections here in Israel are noted by some very terrible things we say about each other, and we're going to get to the politics part of saying nasty things about each other as well as identifying each other in a bit. So rov means majority. An important not subword, but another iteration of the word rov that you'll hear a lot, but you should also use, is rov hamachriya, or rov hamachriya. Here in row 3, that means the overwhelming majority, or simply overwhelmingly, right? A rov hamachriya, or rov hamachriya, excuse me, rov hamachriya means the overwhelming majority, or the vast amount of people. Okay, but the idea is it's not just the majority, it's the overwhelming majority. You say rov hamachriya. As opposed to the majority, the word for minority, which is mi'ut. Okay, mi'ut is a minority both in politics, but also in ethnicity, race, religion, everything you can think of in terms of identity. It's also the word that we use. So minorities are mi'utim. Okay, so the minorities of Israel, hamiutim shel Israel, or hamiutim be'Yisrael, the minorities in Israel. Okay, it would be one way you could use that. Migdal or migdar, again, depending how you say the letter resh, means gender. Okay. Now, 2 words here. These are all classification words, but we use these a lot, and you'll hear these words a lot. These 2 words are very similar in meaning, and that has to do with how to be a Jew is a complicated thing when we look at it through Western lenses, or pretty much any other lens other than our own, right? Because it's religion, it's nationality, it's ethnicity, it's history, it's culture, it's language, it's so many things at once that pretty much most other cultures in the world, with the exception of very few, have one or the other. They're not a combination like we are. And so there are 2 words that are used. The best way I'm going to explain the difference of them is as follows. The 2 words are eda, excuse me, row 6, and motza. Excuse me. Now, again, we're talking modern Hebrew, so please don't ask if this is like the synagogue I grew up in, for example, in Washington, D.C., was called Addis Israel. That's this word here, eda, and it does mean community in the ancient biblical sense, and even in the modern Hebrew sense. But when we use the word eda in modern Hebrew, we're really talking about an ethnic group. Okay, an ethnic group. Excuse me, just fighting off some allergies here. So eda means ethnic group, and motza means origin. Motza is the word that we use when you are using Waze or Google Maps in Hebrew, and you type in your motza, your origin, or your starting point, and your ya'ad, or your destination. Okay, so motza is origin, eda is ethnic group. And these words will get mixed up, just like they do in English, right? When we talk about ethnicity and origin, we're talking usually when we're talking around Jews, for example, eda has to do with what, if you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi or Mizrahi, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Whereas origin, motza, has to do with the country you came from, right? So if I was answering for myself specifically, my eda, I don't like using that word because I think that's a very old term in terms of how I identify myself, but I would say it's Ashkenazi, and my motza is Artsot Abrit. Again, when you're speaking to people and they ask you, and they will ask you because it is Israel, ma motza shelcha, or ma ha'eda shelcha, what is your ethnic group or what is your origin? They're not necessarily asking you, are you a Jew or not, although sometimes that is the case. They're asking, what is your background, meaning your diasporic background, and not referring to North America or the UK or anywhere else, but Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi. That's what they're referring to when these terms are used on a regular basis. So if you are going to a synagogue, for example, that follows a specific minhag, custom, or rite, R-I-T-E, they'll use the word eda. Whereas again, motza is usually more nation state focused. So origin, ethnic group, motza, eda. Another word that we use to categorize people based on identity is nitiyah. Nitiyah is orientation. Okay, so we talk about netiya politit, political orientation, and we also talk about netiya minit, sexual orientation. Okay, so this word you'll also hear quite a lot when we talk about identities in Israel. And like I alluded to before, when we get to our second slide here, and you can see it at the bottom of the screen, words to never use. I know the irony of teaching you words to never use, but they still need to be taught, is the term kinui gnai. Kinui is a nickname, and gnai in general means a slur or something that's not positive, is the most boring way to say it. Kinui gnai means a slur or a pejorative word or a derogatory meaning about someone, referring to someone. Kinui gnai is all of the bad words in all various languages that were used to refer to a different person. And it's not referring to them, and specifically referring to their ethnic or national origin or their religious origin or anything like that. Kinui gnai when it's negative in meaning. Okay, and equally with that is the word gas. Gas is a adjective. It means both coarse. So if you go to the store here in Israel and you buy melach gas, you're buying coarse salt. Melach is salt. Coarse salt, melach gas. It usually comes in very big pieces that you use for cooking. And that's opposed to melach shulchan, table salt, which is usually finer crystals. But gas means both coarse or vulgar, okay, as an adjective. Gas, gasa, gasim, gasot. Okay, let's get into some of those adjectives and identity markers that we use here in Israel and what ones we choose to use and don't use. This first group are ones that you should know very well as newfound Israeli citizens or soon-to-be Israeli citizens, and they all have to do with that aspect of our identities here in Israel. The first word is yelid. Yelid, or yelidat for a woman, it is the same in English as saying blank born or native of blank, right? It's related to the same root that we get the words yeled and yalda, or boy or girl. It also comes from the same root as to give birth or to be born. But yelid is always used before the name of a country or the name of a city or state. Okay, it's not used before an adjective. So ani yelid Artzot Habrit. I am native. I was born in the United States. Okay. Yelid Artzot Habrit. That is one way to say that my national origin, where I was born, is the United States. Okay, so someone who is born in Israel will usually say that they are Yelid Haaretz. Okay, they are native of the land of Israel. Haaretz, when we use it in that context, will always refer to specifically the land of Israel, whatever borders you want to pick, that's what it's referring to. Yelid Haaretz, you are a native Israeli. Yelid any other country means that you were born there. Okay, is not the same thing as you grew up there, it means that you were born there. Okay, first one, Israeli. I put this one here, not just because we're talking about Hebrew here in Israel, but also to remind all of my fellow Olim on this call that you do not have to be born in Israel to be an Israeli. So Israeli, own that word if you have already made Aliyah. Mazal Tov, you are Israeli through and through. You are not, however, this next word, 14, Tzabar. Tzabar or Tzabar, you've also probably heard Sabra, is the nickname that's given to native Israelis. This refers to a very specific type of cactus. Tzabar is what we call in English prickly pear cactus. Funny enough, prickly pear cactus is not native to Israel, much less the Middle East. It's actually from Mexico. If you look at the Mexican flag, the seal of the United States of Mexico, and that's its official name, by the way. The eagle on that cactus, that is the prickly pear cactus, that is the tzabar. So it is actually not from this area, and yet we use it to refer to native Israelis as tzabar or tzabarim as the plural, but we use that word as opposed to the word that many of you know, Oleh or Olah, to distinguish whether you were born in Israel or not. But we're all Israelis. Kulanu Yisraelim. Okay, so always want to make that point clear, especially when I deal with fellow Olim. You are Israeli, you are just not a Sabra. Okay, and also I say that, by the way, to native Israelis. Oleh or Olah refers specifically to an immigrant who came to Israel through the law of return. So therefore they are Jewish according to the state of Israel, Ministry of Interior, not the chief rabbinate. It's very complicated. Like I said, identity is complicated, but just know that Oleh or La specifically refers to I'm going to use the term Jewish immigrant. The regular term for immigrant, mehager, is just an immigrant of any kind. But an oleh or la specifically refers to someone who entered Israel and became an Israeli citizen through the law of return. Okay, and with that, we have two further distinctions. We don't use these as much as perhaps they used to, mainly because of the ambiguity of these, which is oleh chadash or olah chadasha, meaning a quote unquote new immigrant, versus an oleh vatik or an olah vatika. An oleh chadash, I know people who've been here for decades and still use the term oleh chadash or olah chadasha, a new immigrant, to refer to themselves, versus people who rarely will call themselves an oleh vatik or an olah vatika. First off, because there is no time here, right? You are an immigrant. Yes, you're going to hold on to your immigration status for a long time culturally, sociologically, because you're not from this country originally. But when you choose to be one over the other, that's really up to you. There is no set definition for either of these. I, being here nearly 16 years, would never call myself an Oleh Chadash. I don't necessarily want to call myself an Oleh Vatik. Vatik in Hebrew means veteran. It's also a nice term for a senior citizen. And while I am getting up there in age, I just don't like that term. Veteran, I would rather either be an Oleh or simply Yisraeli. That's my personal decision. But again, identity is really important. How you identify yourself is no less important with these words. Let's get to some others. I'm sure you're going to know some of these already, but they're still important to go over. These next 19 through 25 here are the main categories we use in Israeli society to define non-Jews who are citizens of Israel, right? Remember that more than 20% of the population of Israel are Israeli citizens, but not Jews. So what are the words that we use? It's not as clear-cut as it seems. The first one, Aravi. Aravi is Arab. And that is the term in Hebrew, and that's the term in English. We use this term as a collective term. And it's complicated in its own ways in terms of using it as a collective term, because not everyone who falls under the category Aravi calls himself that. Also keeping in mind that both the school systems and the judicial systems are based on religion, not on ethnicity. So Aravi is also very misleading in some ways. What we also have is Notzri, Christian, and Muslimi, Muslim. The two biggest categories of non-Jews in Israel, either Christian or Muslim. Again, these are also problematic terms because within Notzri, Christian, Notzri, Notzria, Notzrim, Notzriot, depending on the conjugation you need to use, there are at least 10 different churches that are recognized in Israel and that have a population here. So Notzri is also very complicated to use as a catch-all identity term, just like Muslimi is, in terms of who is defined as Muslimi, and that gets into both faith as well as socioeconomics. It's very complicated, but just know these three terms, Aravi, Notzri, Muslimi, are used also interchangeably, and that again presents its own challenges. So when you hear these words, you'll know that as much as we use them in Israel, they come with their own challenges, just like some of the ones we've talked about with regards to Jews, and we're going to get to a little bit more. Some other ones that we use, I'm sure you've heard these words before, but they're worth going through again. Bedouin. Bedouin is a Bedouin who are primarily found up in the north, in the Galil, in the Galilee, as well as in the Negev, in the south. They are defined separate out of Aravi for various reasons, both internally, that sedentary Arabs, both in villages and in towns, have always seen Bedouins as a separate entity. Also, in terms of their relation to the state of Israel and their involvement is slightly different. Okay, another group, Druzi, Druzit, Druzim, Druziot, Druze is a group that originated from southern Lebanon and southern Syria that's now found throughout our region. Don't have nearly enough time to go into who they are. There's a sizable community here in Israel, much larger in Lebanon and Syria. Again, they are not defined according to the state of Israel and Israeli society as Aravi, as Arab. They are their own separate identity out of that. Whether or not they agree to that or not is a different story, but just know this is another identity marker in Israel. Two other ones you probably not have heard of as much, and that they're smaller, is Cherkessi and Arami. Cherkessi in English is Circassian. There is a very small Circassian population in the north of Israel, primarily in two separate towns. They are originally from the Caucasus, so that part of the former Soviet Union. They are Muslim in practice, but they are of a different ethnicity, and as such, they are treated different in the state of Israel with their own rights, the beliefs, and so forth. And finally, one of the most recent ones to be approved for state purposes, for official purposes, is Arami. Arami is, we would translate this as Aramean. It also can be Syriac or Assyrian. These are primarily Christians who live up in the north of Israel, a very small community, but who do not define themselves as Aravi, as Arab. So on national identities, when it comes to things like Aravi, Yehudi, Bedouin, Cherkessi, Druzi, there is now Arami. When it comes to a national identity, we talked about this word a couple weeks ago, Le'om. This is one of the latest ones that's been approved to be used when appropriate on national documents. There aren't always a lot of these times when you do it. In fact, I don't think I have my Teudat Zehut on me. If you get a recent Teudat Zehut in the last few years, you'll see on it, it no longer lists Le'om. Le'om meaning nationality or ethnicity, again, because the terms are so intertwined with one another. Okay, they no longer list that. You can figure out someone's ethnicity because their Hebrew birth date is listed on it if they're Jewish. That's sort of the go around to it. But on other official documents, you will see, for example, someone who identifies as Arami will have Arami on their identification documents. Okay, let's get to some other ones that you hear on a regular basis with a little bit of nuance to them. Ashkenazi. Ashkenazi is anyone coming from Western, Central, or Eastern Europe without any difference. We did used to use the words like Yeki to refer in a slang term to German Jews. We don't use those separations anymore. We do talk about Motza in that respect. So we talked about the other week of Ima Polania, the stereotypical Jewish mother, which in modern Hebrew we say the Polish mother. So we do make some differences between countries back in the day in Europe, but otherwise the catch-all term Ashkenazi is for that. And that's why the next two get complicated, because Ashkenazi is the catch-all term for Western, Central, and Eastern European Jews, or Jews who come from those backgrounds, versus Sfaradi and Mizrahi. So first off, in modern Hebrew, we say Sfaradi, not Sephardi, it's Sfaradi. And I wrote Sephardic there because that's what a lot of people would say in English. Sfaradi comes from the word Sfarad. We've talked about this word before. It is is found in the Bible. In the medieval period, it was attached to the Iberian Peninsula, specifically Spain. And so Sfaradi refers to anyone who can trace themselves to medieval Spain and Portugal. And then after the Inquisition and expulsion, ended up everywhere from the Americas to North Africa, to the Balkans, to the Ottoman Empire. Sfaradi is a very specific Eda. There are subsects within Sfaradim, whether they are from Rhodes or Greece or Turkey or Syria or Morocco, but Sfaradi is a very specific one that refers to that. And that is as opposed to this other term, Mizrahi. Mizrahi literally means Eastern. right? Mizrach means east, Mizrahi, eastern, but it's not a great term. Just like Sfaradi and Ashkenazi get sort of stretched and pulled and pushed in different ways, Mizrahi basically means everyone else who isn't either Ashkenazi or Sfaradi. And that's not quite fair because this includes everyone from Temanim, Yemenite Jews, to Parsim, Persian Jews, to Bukharim, Bukhari Jews, to Hodim, Indian Jews. Anyone who doesn't fit under Ashkenazi or Sfaradi ends up being Mizrahi. And that's not quite fair, both in terms of that east-west connotation, also because their minhagim, their customs are different from one another. It's still a term that's used. It's even a term that's used towards Sfaradim. Just know that these words are problematic. They are used all the time, but you're not necessarily get to know who someone is just by using the terms Ashkenazi, Sfaradi, or Mizrahi. Usually when someone wants to talk about their specific Eda, they'll use the word Eda or Motza, to further illustrate where they're from. So Mizrahi person could be Kurdi, could be of Kurdish background, or Iraqi, Babylonian, Baghdadi, Iraqi, non-Kurdish origin, or any of the other many locations that Jews have lived throughout the world in the last 2,000 years. These are the main terms that we use. We have two modern terms, one's more modern than the other, that are also important to put out there because we also treat them as Israeli society slightly different. First one is Brit HaMoatzot L'Shavar. We've talked about this word before, Brit HaMoatzot. Brit HaMoatzot is how we say in modern Hebrew, the USSR. Brit means covenant or union. Moatzot is the plural of moatza, which is a council. We use this term in Israel to define for city councils and regional councils and local councils. Moatza in Russian is Soviet, right? So the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviets, the Brit HaMoatzot is how we say the Soviet Union in Hebrew, and then L'Sha'avar. L'Sha'avar at the end of a word means formerly or previously or in the past. Okay, avar means past, L'Sha'avar, that has passed or previously or former. Okay, so Brit HaMoatzot L'Sha'avar refers to all the Jews who came from the former Soviet Union because again, they weren't all Russian. They weren't necessarily all Russian speaking, nor could they trace themselves from Russia for periods of time. They could have been from Ukraine, they could have been from Uzbekistan, they could have been from all sorts of different places. But this is a catch-all term, just like Mizrahi and Sfaradi and Ashkenazi that get placed to a lot of people. And then finally, last but not least, is Ethiopia. We're going to get to this one when we get to words to never use. This is the appropriate word to use when we talk about the country of Ethiopia. Someone who is Ethiopian is Ethiopi. Ethiopi, Ethiopit, Ethiopim, Ethiopiot. If you want to say someone is of Ethiopian origin, min motza Ethiopi or min motza Ethiopia. Okay, of Ethiopian origin or from country or several generations later. Okay, so let's move on to some other identifying markers that we use here in Israel. This one you'll hear all the time, right, is when we get to Jews. And how do we define ourselves? We talked about Eda and Motza just now, right? Ethnic and diaspora backgrounds. Now we're going to talk about another way we categorize ourselves here in Israel is by religious affiliation. There are many more than these, but these are the big ones that you're going to hear on a regular basis. And actually, some of these you probably don't hear on a regular basis, but if you're tuned into Israeli politics and society, you will hear these ones a lot. First one is Chiloni. Chiloni is not a term that people who are Chiloni defined for themselves. It was a term placed on them. It was originally actually a pejorative term. It since no longer has that meaning. Chiloni means secular. And we use this term to mean secular in all respects. However, someone who is defined as Chiloni or defines themselves as that isn't necessarily secular in the sense of being irreligious or anti-religion. They could have some vestiges of religious practice. It's a very big catch-all category term that often becomes politicized, just like many of these other terms, if that hasn't been clear already. But this is one word that we use to describe Jews who it's more not being observant rather than what they actually do. It's talking about what they don't do, okay? Whereas if you ask Jews time and time and again on polls, you ask them how they identify and you give them the big categories that you see here, this one usually gets a lot, is Masorati. Masorati is traditional. Okay, that's what it means, traditional, Masorati. And that is, again, a huge spectrum of people who are partially Shabbat observant to people who fast on Yom Kippur and don't do much else, right? It could be a whole thing. The point is, this is how people identify themselves. And people who would otherwise, one group would call them Chiloni, would call themselves Masorati, and vice versa. It's messy identity, folks. I can see we're getting quite a lot of Q&A and chat up there. If you're asking me, calling me out on any of this, thanks, but just know it is a messy deal that we deal with on a regular basis here in Israeli society. Masorati is one of the ones that often people call themselves the most. It gets quite a sizable chunk when you see people identify themselves just on these terms. If you start asking more specific questions, it's going to change. But Masorati is a big one that we see quite a lot of people identify with. And it's a spectrum. Masorati, by the way, is also the term that's used in modern Israel to define the conservative movement, the Jewish conservative movement you may know from other countries around the world. It's called Hatnua Masortit here in Israel. The Masorati movement, Tnua is a movement, but it also means traditional. Does not mean conservative in the political sense. Just make that very clear. It means traditional. Dati. Dati is a word that gets thrown around just as much as all these other words. It means religious. Dati, again, can mean all sorts of different things. It is not necessarily used as a marker. Instead, we'll use this next one, Dati Le'umi. Dati Le'umi usually gets translated, as you see here, as religious national. It sometimes is referred to as the Israeli version of modern Orthodox. Dati Leumi is an Israeli construct through and through. It's the Dati, religious, meaning usually Orthodoxy, and Leumi, meaning Zionist, meaning usually, especially post-1967, holding on to the territories that were won during 1967, holding the balance of religion and state slightly more in favor of religion, but still holding there being a separation of the two. That's a wide generalization, but just know Dati Leumi is usually used instead of just Dati. Sometimes you'll see both on there, but that really just dilutes very similar camp. And then we have Haredi. Haredi, for many years was translated as ultra-Orthodox. I put it here because that's still what many people use. I don't like that term, Haredi. If you go to Wikipedia, you will see the term Haredi, H-A-R-E-D-I, written out, sometimes called ultra-Orthodoxy. Haredi is also a really unfair word because it's also a spectrum. All of these words are a spectrum. Haredi is also one. Okay, because Haredi, there was actually a great article you may have seen in the Times of Israel in English about the upcoming elections and the polls, and they did a survey among Haredim in the Haredi news outlets, and they broke down the responses into 4 groups. Okay, this was in the Haredi news, but they broke it down to 4 groups, and it's really interesting what they did. They broke it down into Litzai, Chasidi, Chabad, and Sfaradi. Let me explain those 4 things because they're really important to understand. Under the big umbrella identity moniker of Haredi is what we would say 4 main groups, right? We've talked about one of them already, Sfaradi. Sfaradi ultra-Orthodox refers to people who primarily who are of Sfaradi background. They're traditionally affiliated with the Shas political party and its leaders. Chabad is Chabad. It's just such a big movement, and it doesn't necessarily follow the same ways as the other Hasidic movements do, that it has its own category because it's so big. And then we have these 2 others, Litzai and Hasidi. Anyone knows a little bit of Jewish history knows the importance of the break between the Litzaim, or as we would say in Jewish history and in Ashkenazi Hebrew, the Misnagdim and the Hasidim, right? Litzaim are non-Hasidic Haredim. They They do not belong to a Hasidic dynasty or follower. They are ultra-Orthodox non-Hasidic, and Hasidi is Hasidic. Okay, that's the difference between the two. You can look up the difference further between them, but just know when we're talking about Haredi, there is a huge spectrum there. Also in terms of beliefs and affiliations and socioeconomic status, just like with all these other ones. But just know within Haredi, we have further delineations that aren't often told when we're learning about Israel and Hebrew. Okay, but these are the terms that we use in modern Hebrew, Litai and Hasidi. Okay, when we talk about Haredi. Let's get into some more identity markers because we can't get enough of them. Someone asked the other week about LGBT. That's no less important. How we say that in Israel, in Hebrew, that is appropriate. That is not getting into double entendres, although we are going to get to that second when they have words have two meanings based on your intonation and context. So first, the word for straight. I didn't put the transliteration for these because these are relatively new terms in modern Hebrew, and as such, they're simply loan words from English. So if you want to say straight in modern Hebrew, you could simply say straight or heterosexuali when referring to heterosexuals. The term that has been created by the LGBT community here in Israel for LGBT Israelis is lahatab. They simply took the LGBT in English, which itself stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and converted it into Hebrew. So lahatab, lesbit, homosexuali, trans or transit, bisexuali. Okay, and they just took the first letters of each of those terms, just like LGBT, turned it into a new word, lahatab or lahatabi, if it's an adjective. Okay, so LGBT either as a noun or as an adjective, lahatab, lahatabi, row 42. Okay, now we're going to get into the problems. And the problems is when we start using identity as weapons against each other, as negative connotations. And while that has existed, unfortunately, for a long time in Israeli society, one of the cornerstones of Israeli politics meeting identity was in 1981. And this is a really important term at the bottom of the screen here. We're going to get into some other problematic words very shortly, but this is one of the big moments when what we call the Hashed Ha'edati came out. The Shed Ha'edati is the communal or the ethnic spirit came out of the bottle. And you hear this term used by politicians, Hashed Ha'edati, whenever identity politics get used in Israel for cynical reasons, or someone uses an ethnic or racial slur against someone else. We talk about that the ethnic spirit, the ethnic genie has been released from the bottle, creates all sorts of havoc. This is one classic example that if you want to learn more about Israeli history and society and culture, you need to know about this. It's called Ne'um HaChachchachim. Ne'um means speech. Chachchachim is a derogatory word for Jews of North African origin. The idea was that Jews who speak North African dialects of Arabic, it sounds like they're saying chach all the time. They're overemphasizing the sounds of ch and ch. So it sounds like all that they're saying is chach, 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 chach. And it was used as a slur against them. And in the speech in 1981, it was right before the 1981 elections for Knesset, a very famous entertainer and a comedian at the time of Ashkenazi background, gets up on the stage here in Tel Aviv in Kikar Rabin and gives a speech where he basically says, and I'm going to paraphrase it in English for you, thank you all for coming. It's so nice to see so many of you here tonight. It's also so nice to not see any chachchachim here. Who are barely serving as guards at military posts, let alone serving at all in the country, whereas the people who are here are from the most illustrious combat units in Israel, right? It was very pejorative. It was very hurtful. We could say it was racist. A few days later, Menachem Begin, and that speech, by the way, was for at the time called the Alignment Party, now which was the ancestor of the Labor Party. A few days later, Likud gives a speech where they blast that speech as being racist and backwards, that's saying that all chachchachim vote for Likud, and saying how Chachachim. I've only heard this word once before. I don't think if even ever, Menachem Begin says, but ultimately we are all Jews, and overwhelmingly wins the election. So it's held up as a point, and it comes up again and again, even though that speech by many political scientists will say cost the alignment party the vote by several points, by several seats in Knesset. That cycle of using identity as a slur against someone else gets used again and again. It's been used even in the last few cycles, unfortunately. So it's an important milestone to understand how identity is used both positively and more specifically negative. The next four words get into that. These next four words are not included in the next slide. These next four words are words that they can be weaponized. They themselves are not bad words. It's very much about the context and the intonation of the speaker and who's listening. Okay, so full disclosure there before people jump on me. Okay, the first word is mifagil. Mifagil is the same exact word that we use in English, retarded, in the sense of something is slow, right? So for example, right now, Knesset is not in session. We call that a pagrat hakayitz. Pagrat hakayitz is the summer recess. Okay, the same root, pe gimel resh, that we get for the word retarded also means a session, like a recess. When we use it in modern Hebrew, the word lifagil, the verb, it means something that goes slow. So a watch that has gone slow, or something that otherwise moves at a different pace. But obviously, this word gets weaponized against people for various reasons, not just people who may have occupational or emotional or physical challenges, but anything that is considered weird or different or slow in any respect, unfortunately gets this as a negative term. It is not negative in its origin. It has become negative in many ways. Same as the word for gay or homosexual in Hebrew, homo. This can be used both totally neutral and completely negative and thus derogatory. Depends on the speaker, depends on the context. So keep that in mind. It is not always a negative word. It is not a good word to use necessarily. Homosexuality is better. Lahatabi is better. Just like with mifagil, there are other ways to say someone with, instead of calling someone who may be defined by occupational therapists as that word, instead using physically challenged or something like that. Same with the word homo, okay? Context is key. Same with the next two words, Yemani and Smolani. Yemani and Smolani both come from the same origins, meaning Yamin, right hand, right, and Smol, left, as in direction, right? So Yamin, right, Smol, left. Yemani means right wing or rightist or right tending in modern Hebrew, and Smolani means left wing or left tending in Israeli politics. Now, what is Yemani and Smolani has changed throughout the years. It still is changing in Israel, but these words are used as weapons in identifying, and especially before an election season, you will hear this a lot, so that Yemani and Smolani become slurs. They become kinue gnai against people, fellow Israeli citizens, based on their political beliefs. Okay, deep breaths, folk. We need to go through this next slide. It's going to go fast because I'm not going to say the words out loud. I am going to give them context. There is a big banner at the top that indicates you should never use these words, but you should know these words exist. You've probably heard these words before. Know that they are not acceptable. As much as Israelis like to joke that we North Americans are over PC, that we are over politically correct when it comes to things, these words are hard lines in the sand. The following words, you never use the following words aloud or in any context, okay? So let me just pull that up. Here we go. Just make sure that but it is important, as I said many times before, it is important that you know these words. They are used, unfortunately, quite frequently in modern Israel. You should know these words and know not to use them, or know that when someone is using it, it's not the right thing to do. Okay, this first word, I get a lot of pushback from people saying, well, this word is in the Bible. And you are right. This first word, row 3, is indeed in the Bible. It refers to what we now call the modern countries of Ethiopia and Eritrea and Sudan. It was also referred to, I believe, if not in the Tanakh, then it's certainly in the commentary with regards to the Queen of Sheba, that she was of this origin. However, we are talking modern Hebrew here, folks. In modern Hebrew, this word, while the N word in English comes with a lot more historical background, this is the equivalent of the N word. You may never, ever, ever use this word in any conversation, in any context. It's just not used. And if you ask someone who is of Motza Ethiopi, they will tell you this word is unacceptable. Okay, we don't use this word. Same with this next word. You may have grown up hearing this word, especially those of you from Ashkenazi backgrounds. This word is equally understood in modern Israel and is unacceptable to use. Row 5 refers, this word actually comes from a very famous performer from France in the 50s and 60s, who was very famous before she underwent a sex change operation in Morocco, and then went by this stage name. The stage name is French. So originally it means ladybug. However, in modern Hebrew, this term has become a catch-all term for, as you see here, transsexuals and transvestites, as well as stereotypically effeminate men. It is absolutely unacceptable to use. It is like using the word gay or homo, like I said, as a slur against someone. This word is uniformly unacceptable to use. And finally, this last word, these first four are the absolute worst of them. Again, we're not going through curse words, we're not going through expletives, we're going through identities and words that are acceptable and words that are not acceptable when we talk about ourselves. And this is the fourth of the four really bad words to use to describe people. We're going to get to some more bad ones, but this one is equally bad. This is, as you see here, a woman presumed to be promiscuous based on external appearances. Okay, it comes from Arabic. It comes from a vulgar word for female anatomy, female genitalia. It is used ironically as a compliment. If someone is calling someone else that, it can also be a compliment, which is why this word should not be used in general. There are many other words that are used as compliments. We went through some of those in last week's class for saying something is good, or if someone looks good. You can use much more acceptable terms than this one. Don't use this term. Here are some other terms you'll probably not use, hopefully you will never use, but you will hear, unfortunately, on a regular basis. Not necessarily regular basis, depending on who you are hanging around, but still important never to use these terms. This first one means literally filthy Arab. It is a terrible term against Arab citizens and Arabs in general. Don't use this term. Just like this next term, it has that ush ending at the end to indicate something is diminutive, meaning it's small, it's worthless, it's of lesser value. Don't use this term either. This is a classic racial slur in Israel. We don't use this term. This term is a little bit more contemporary, and it is also problematic. The first word literally does mean to infiltrate, as in to cross lines, to cross a border. And along with the word, the next word in it, which refers to someone from the country of Sudan, they both are a catch-all term for anyone who is of dark skin origin, who is not Ethiopian, who is in Israel, either seeking refuge or here for work. But is a catch-all term. They're both very pejorative terms. This term started out very pejorative. It's become a little bit more accepted. I still think it's not acceptable, the first one. You will hear it heard very often. It is a play on the Ashkenazi Hebrew pronunciation of the word dati, or dat in this case, because in Ashkenazi Hebrew, taf without a dot in the middle becomes s. So it becomes das, and then the a vowel under it becomes o. So that's where you get this term that is used by Chaledim and Datim, ultra-Orthodox and religious Jews all the time, but it still has negative connotation when used by people who are not from that community, as well as the term using a bird that looks very similar in terms of colors to someone who's in traditional ultra-Orthodox garb. These are not terms to be used or repeated, but you should be recognizing them and cognizant when you hear them. And this one is particularly bad. It has the on ending, which also means diminutive, so it means small or little or a child. In this case, this is probably the closest equivalent in modern Hebrew to the K word for Jews. So we also don't use this word. Even if you are talking about someone being petty and small, you don't use this specific term. It is very loaded. Historically and culturally, we don't use this term either. And finally, the last two. The last two are terms that you will hear a lot. You will even hear in proper, quote unquote, proper terms talking about people, but these are not acceptable terms. Both terms come from Arabic in origin, and as such, they refer to Jews who come from Muslim countries of origin, usually, as you see here, working class male or female youth of Sfaradi or Mizrahi background. It's usually typifying them as being stereotypically gruff and aggressive and low class. These are bad terms. We don't use these terms either. You will hear them used very frequently and sort of bandied around. These are not appropriate words to use. Okay, I'm going to stop here. That was difficult for me to go through, but I think very important for all of us to be reminded of words that are not to be used. Even though words are created, that doesn't necessarily mean they're to be used, but they should be recognized. I want to stop here and focus on something a little bit similar, but pointing it out. If you've never heard this before, it's a good segue into further into Israeli society and talking about different identities and populations. And we'll share this in the recording. We'll put a link to this as well. There's a great website, teachmehebrew.com, and they take a few popular songs and then they transliterate and translate the songs. This song is from the early 2000s. It's called Shirat HaSticker, the sticker song, from a band called Hadag Nachash from Jerusalem. You may have heard this song before. It was incredibly popular at the time when it came out. And Hadag Nachash toured around North America as well. This song, Shirat HaSticker, comes from identity, an identity that is often displayed in Israel through the use of stikerim, bumper stickers on the back of cars or on other things that we wear on ourselves or carry around that indicate where we stand politically, culturally, religiously, and so forth. And so what they did was they took all the major stickers that you can find in everyday Israel and turned them into lyrics of a song. The music video you're not going to see here because it doesn't have the English. Has people, all the different backgrounds of Israeli society. So Jews, Arabs, secular, religious, women, men, soldiers, even terrorists, and singing this song together, lip syncing the song. It's a very powerful song when it came out. It was during the second Intifada, so it was as much external as was internal critique of society. It's a very important song in Israeli culture, and I want to share it with you so that we could end it here, as there are a lot of issues that go into identity with this. Okay. So let me play this. Let me just make sure that it plays optimally. Just 1 second. Share sound, optimize for video. Yes. All right. Let me play this, and then we will.
דורש שלום, תנו לצהל לנצח, עם חזק עושה שלום, תנו לצהל לכסח, אין שלום עם ערבים, אל תיתנו להם רובים, קרבי זה אחי, אחי, גיוס לכולם, תור לכולם, שום ייאוש בעולם, יש הזה כאן, הנחמן מאומן, no fear, משיח בעיר, אין ערבים, אין פיגועים, בקץ מסכן יהודים, העם עם הגולן, העם עם הטרנספר, חבר אתה חסר, הקדוש ברוך הוא, אנחנו בוחרים בך, בחירה ישירה זרה, הקדוש ברוך הוא, אנחנו קנאים לך, ימותו הקנאים, כמה רוע, אפשר אפשר לבלוע, אבא תרחם, קוראים לי נחמן ואני מגמגם כמה רוע, אפשר לבלוע, אבא תרחם, ברוך השם אני נושם ולכן.
I'm actually going to stop it there because we have a bunch of questions, but I wanted to share that in the context of that gets into a lot of identity and how people identify themselves. And so, like I said, it's all the stickers that you would see on a regular basis, at least 20 years ago on the street, to best describe themselves in different identities, both themselves and others. So it's a great illustration of how we get into that and how tense it can be to identify other people. Okay, I'm going to go through as many questions as I can because I see we have a bunch in the Q&A. Let me open that up here. All right, let's start. Okay, Sanford asks about a glass of scotch. Very important here, Sanford. The word for a glass is kos. Okay, we've talked about this before. Both pronunciation and spelling in Hebrew is incredibly important. And this is a great illustration why, because the word for a glass is kos. And it is unfortunately spelled here wrong because my Nikud generator didn't even want to spell the word because it's so wrong. If you were to take the O out of this word and make it U, then it's a bad word, as you see here in the transliteration. So apologies for the vowels there. But kos is a glass, and haramat kosit is what we use when we have a toast for someone, right? It's raising a glass. So that word kos and kosit are perfectly all right. It's when the O turns into U that it is not a polite word. Sanford also asks, how about someone who writes or throws left-handed? That's a great question. So let me get back to identities here. So someone who is right, as in right-handed, is yemani or yemini, and someone who's left-handed, like myself, is smali. Okay, there's no nun there anymore, smali. Now, yamin has a nun in it. Right has a word as a nun in it. So it's yemini is usually the way we'll say it to mean a right-handed person versus yemani, which is right-handed, right wing, excuse me, versus smali, left-handed, smolani, left wing. Okay, and even how they're said, you can hear sometimes the antagonism towards someone who holds those different beliefs, but that is the difference there. Philip asks, what is a kippah sruga? What about a kippah sruga? Kippah sruga, for those of you who don't know, the word sarug or sarug means knit, and a knit kippah usually is the term that we use for dati le'umi. Again, religion, it could get its own class, and maybe we'll do one in the future, but there's a lot of different things. But typically, someone who wears a knit kippah, and usually a small knit kippah, is dati or dati le'umi, or masorati, either of those three. Bruce, I just explained why no. Someone who is of Ethiopian background is Motza Etiopi. That is the only way to identify someone. We do not use that word at the top here. Okay, folks, I'm going to say it again as clearly as I can. We are talking modern Hebrew, not biblical Hebrew. I don't care what the word is in Megillat Esther. I understand that is the word that historically was used for that region. I understand that historically that was the word that was used for people of that region. Modern Hebrew is what we're learning here and teaching here. This word in row 3 here is unacceptable to use. It is not a substitute for Ethiopia, for someone of Ethiopian origin. We do not use this word, full stop. Anna asks, how would I express that I'm a mix of Ashkenazi and Italian ancestry? I was taught that Italian Jews are our own distinct group, Italkim. You're right, Anna, there is a lot of study on this, and we usually say Italki. So you could say Ani Ashkenazia ve'Italkit. Okay, that's how you would turn Ashkenazi into female, Ashkenazia or Ashkenazit, and Italkit. Okay, but very good point there. Thank you for saying that. Ellen, Aramean is definitely different than Armenian. Okay, where is that word here? Arami, Aramean, okay, is someone who identifies as Aramean, which we would also call Syrian or Assyrian. Armenian in Hebrew is Armeni. Okay, so listen to how I say it. It's different. It's going to be spelled very similarly, especially because, again, we don't write with these vowels in Hebrew. Aramean, Arami, or Arami. Armenian, Armeni. Okay, that's the difference. But it is a difference. Thank you for asking. Someone asks, how do you say Samaritans in Hebrew? Shomronim. Okay, also another subgroup that we did not include here in the Jews, but thank you. They are usually typified, included with Jews, even though that's a complicated story in and of itself. Shomronim or Shomronim are Samaritans. Okay. Richard, the singular feminine of Tsabar is Tsabarit. Tsabar, Tsabarit, Tsabarim, Tsabarot, Tsabariot. Okay. Myra, is immigrant used for non-Jewish immigrants? No, this term is only used for Jewish immigrants or immigrants who come to Israel under the law of return. Otherwise, we use the word mehager or mehageret, which means both an immigrant and an emigrant. Okay. All right, we are at the top of the hour. Thank you all for joining. Again, this was a difficult lesson, but an important lesson to get through these words and to understand what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And this will be up on YouTube in the next few days. If you have any questions, if you have any comments for future classes, please write to us at Nefesh B'Nefesh. And we will see you all next week for our last class of the summer session. And then we're going to break. You can follow along and repeat all the lessons that you would like on YouTube until we meet again. But we will see you next week for our last class here of the summer. So, toda rabah, thank you all so much. And lehitrot, see you all very soon.